I'm Marcel Rindisbacher. I'm the director of this exciting new venture, the Ravi K. Mehrotra Institute for Business, Markets and Society. And we have done a couple of events, and today we have a panel discussion about stakeholder value maximization, shareholder, all of that. Business Roundtable 2019, a retrospective about how this has changed or has not changed practice, and it's a very important conversation to have. I'm very excited to have a very competent panel here, and also a great moderator, Kurt Nickisch, who is a Questrom alumni and is also working for the Harvard Business Review ID cast. He's the voice of the podcast of our institute at the moment as well, which is called Is Business Broken? And please watch out and listen to what we are doing. So there's no further ado. Kurt, you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Marcel. It's a pleasure to be on stage with these folks to talk about this 5-year anniversary, using that as a moment to investigate and discuss and interrogate what it really means. 5 years ago, the Business Roundtable came out with a pledge to emphasize the importance of commitment to stakeholders, all stakeholders, employees, communities, suppliers, as well as shareholders. And on paper, it was a big shift from the purpose of a corporation being really just to solely maximize shareholder value to something more than that. And so we're going to ask, like, in practice, what is the impact of this pledge 5 years later? How has it changed how companies operate? What does it mean for capitalism? And what are those consequences of it so far? And what are the open questions to be answered going forward? We have 5 amazing people here to help sort through these questions. I'm going to start at the very end. Lynn Payne is a professor at Harvard Business School. Her work is on corporate governance and boards. To her right is Om Bhatt. He's the former chair and CEO of the State Bank of India. He also serves on boards of industrial giants in India. Next to him is Anthony Allett, who is the former chair and CEO of Silgan Holdings, a manufacturing and packaging public company. And you also serve on some other boards. Mm-hmm. And then sticking with boards here, James Orlikov, who is the president of Orlikov and Associates. It's a consulting firm that specializes in governance and advises boards on strategy, leadership, system development, et cetera. So we really have some great perspectives on this, and let's just start the ball rolling. We're busy people, and we have a lot to talk about here with this big topic. So, Tony, let's start with you there in the middle. When the Business Roundtable made this statement, were you still CEO at the time? Yeah. Yep. Okay. Silgan Holdings was not one of the 181 Correct. Companies that's part of the Business Roundtable. What was your reaction to it?
Great question. First of all, I just want to thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I think the purpose of this institute is fantastic. And I think the idea of just this very kind of a conversation is really great that we can have it. So I was shocked and disappointed when Roundtable came out. And the reason that maybe surprise is a better word. The surprise really comes from, if you look at the words they said at the time, it didn't really fit with the recommendation. And by the way, they went a little further what you said. They said the purpose of a business is to serve all stakeholders. But in that release, they talk about the power of free markets, and which I think we hopefully all generally agree on, the great wealth creation that comes from free markets. They actually talked about how good, well-run companies are actually doing all of this. And then they actually named some of their own companies and said, well, we're doing it, but everyone else should do it. I think what comes from that, and I think it's so important, is that this is what a real shareholder capitalist is doing all the time. They are thinking about all of those constituents. And so I really didn't understand why they felt the need to add that. And so for me, that was kind of the sort of the main point. I think in kind of the research I've looked at, and even what they talk about, the issue seems to be more about short-termism versus long-termism, right? And if you talk about where people tend to say shareholder capitalism fails, they seem to be more around issues of people were making short-term decisions, which really is the beauty of the system, is those people get churned out over time, and only the ones who focus on the needs of customers and employees ultimately succeed in a shareholder capitalist system. So that was my reaction to it.
Okay. Jamie, you work with boards. What was the reception in the boardroom kind of immediately?
It was less impactful. I think most of the motivation is coming from the regulators and the press. I mean, I think legislative changes like Sarbanes-Oxley were far more known and impactful than the Business Roundtable movement. I think there was an awareness of it, but I strongly agree with Tony. I think the short-term focus, the quarterly reporting focus tends to dominate, and tends to kind of almost be a gravity well which pulls people back to that perspective. So that concept is one. The second one kind of goes back to Peter Drucker's famous quote, the only way you can serve multiple customers is if you serve them all equally badly. So the whole notion of, well, that's great, we can try to focus on stakeholders, but how do we prioritize? What do we mean? Like you rattled off a list. Mm-hmm. And I've not yet seen any real attempt to come up with a kind of a standardized sense of what we mean when we say stakeholders, and then how we prioritize them. So it's kind of out there in the ever-present elsewhere.
Okay. I want to ask you, this is a U.S. group, right? The Business Roundtable, these were American CEOs. Did you feel the ripple in India? Is this, at the time, Paul Polman, changing his company for and trying to be more responsive to the youth. I mean, this was part of this was certainly a moment, and I'm just curious, whether there was a big reception to this in India and elsewhere.
So thanks, Kurt, for that question. But I think in India, historically, a lot of this had already been going on. In India, the father of the nation is Mahatma Gandhi, right? It was he who sort of led the independence movement. And he had said, and I quote, that those in power should consider themselves as trustees and use their vast resources, power, and influence for the good of the people. This is what he had said. We have the Tata Group in India, which is possibly the largest group of its kind anywhere in the world, right? Even in terms of revenues, profit, it may be in the top 5. But interestingly, 62% of its equity has been put into a trust. And that trust funds a lot of education, a lot of medical research, all kinds of things. And again, as a trust, maybe it is one of the largest in the world. Imagine 62% of everything from one of the largest conglomerates in the world goes into a trust, and the trust does a lot of philanthropy, right? And I think in India it comes from, India has also been home to 3 of the largest global religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, right? And all these religions, what they talk about is selflessness, devotion to the public good, and the pursuit of righteousness. So if you look at it culturally and historically, and if you look at, if you accept the term genetic memory, Indians have been sort of hardwired into a different kind of thinking. And which is why, as we speak, today India is the only country in the world where by law there is a requirement for corporates to put 2% of their profits into something known as corporate social responsibility activities. It could be education, it could be water, it could be agriculture. So therefore in India, there was hardly any reaction in the sense that, okay, these guys are waking up now. We've been doing it for maybe a few million years.
They're moving in our direction almost. Yeah. Lynn, you study corporate governance, boards. Your career has spanned, the rise of shareholder value maximization and really linking it to, executive pay to drive that. And then here comes this moment where Business Roundtable, this group is stepping away from it. What was your reaction at the time, and what did you make of it?
Well, I have to say, my first reaction is, why are they doing this now? I was on vacation.
Yeah.
It was August the 19th, and I was about to go to the beach.
They did it in August. Interesting. Okay.
It was interesting.
That
It
is
was done
interesting,
in August. No, I mean, I had a bunch of different reactions at once. One was, why are they so late to the party? We've been talking about this for the last 30 years. But then the real question for me was, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? And partly because I remember the 1997 statement. So as you know, the Business Roundtable comes out with these statements periodically. And in 1997, they had come out with a statement saying that the purpose of the corporation is to maximize returns to the owners, to the shareholders in their framework, and the paramount duty is to shareholders. And several years ago, I did some research on why they came out with that statement. I actually tracked down the gentleman who led the group that wrote the statement. And what he said to me when I asked him this was, we were under pressure from institutional investors to do this. And for sure, institutional investors had been kind of beating the drum of shareholder value for a number of years. And of course, by that time, there were also laws that provided an incentive for companies to align executive pay with shareholders' interests. So you can see that these two things are starting to come together. But interestingly, the 1997 statement was a departure from the 1981 statement, which was much more similar to what came out in 2019 than the 1997 statement. So in some sense, the Business Roundtable was going back to what it had had in the early 1980s. And in that early 1980s statement, they said, the shareholder must receive a good return, but the legitimate interests of other stakeholders also has to be considered. And they used the word constituents at that time rather than the word stakeholders. So there are a lot of questions, but of course, just like you, I wanted to know, well, what does this mean in practice? Because the statement itself was extremely vague.
Yeah. It is interesting to think about just that. I mean, for a long time, right, it was just dogma. I have no choice. This is what a fiduciary duty. This is what I have to do, number one, above all. And this is the way to run companies. So what made them change it? What was this in response to? Why come back to,
Why come back? Of course, I don't know what the immediate trigger was or the tipping point. But if you think back to 2019, there were so many criticisms of the shareholder value model being leveled. And I won't go into all of them, but I would just highlight what I see as the top three. One has already been mentioned, Tony and Jamie, this whole question about short-termism, this concern that it was fostering a kind of short-termism in the sense of just being guided by quarterly returns and being so willing to do whatever it took to meet shareholders' quarterly expectations, never mind the future. So this short-termism was one of them. A second set of concerns was around externalities, or what economists call externalities. Like, what effects does this system have on third parties, on public goods? How is it affecting the environment? How is it affecting income inequality? And there's a lot of concern that 35 years of focusing on shareholder value was at the expense of investing in workers. And we saw stagnant wages, even though we saw lots of productivity increases and growing shareholder wealth. So that was a second bucket. A third bucket of criticisms was really around this system seems to be undermining our democratic institutions, that shareholders and companies using shareholder value as a rationale for blocking legislation that might help other stakeholders, saying, I have a fiduciary duty to my shareholders, and therefore, if this legislation goes through, I will have to work harder to produce those returns, so I'm going to block this legislation. Mm-hmm. And of course, the rationale of moving to tax havens, so really undermining government capacity. So there were other criticisms too, but all of this kind of added up to a kind of erosion of confidence in the system. And you could see from surveys at the time, but also just an outpouring of books from people who were not anti-capitalist, but people who said the system needs to be fixed. And so we saw lots of books. So all of that was going on. What was the immediate trigger? I don't know, but I think it was kind of a response to all this, trying to say we're going to try to make the system better.
Yeah. Let me add 2 more criticisms. One was just value transfer, right? That you have, you've got a lot of companies that just, get an activist shareholder on, move profits forward, sell the company, get out, and so you have value transfer instead of value creation happening. And then executive compensation. I mean, we mentioned it just very briefly, but that's just a big one. As far as social image of companies, that was a big thing that played into this pressure.
Yeah, and that certainly, I think, was part of the whole view of what's the contribution to income inequality coming from this system. I mean, what about half the U.S. population has some investment in the stock market, but the top 10% of households controls 80% of the stock market. So when you're maximizing value for shareholders, you're making your shareholders wealthy. Now, that has racial implications. It has social implications. So all of these things, plus executive compensation was kind of the face of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in one second? Because I agree with those, why they did it.
Yeah.
I would say, again, I think it was an opportunity lost, because I think we could have had a conversation about short-term, long-term, which still covers a lot of what we're talking about. And that would have been a really interesting conversation, right? How should business make themselves more long-term focused? What kind of incentive plans should drive that? We lost that opportunity. I also think that, because I am such a believer in the power of free markets, they lost the opportunity to stand up against some of those forces and say, well, look, there's a lot going on. Let's talk what's going on internationally. What part of what's driving the imbalance here, I believe, is that you've got the middle class around the world is rising because of free markets. And of course, in the US, that's not great for laborers, and it is good for executives of these multinational companies. But that's sort of an unfortunate outcome of an international program, too. So it was a chance to talk about some of those points, and instead we kind of defaulted to there's a new purpose.
Let's put out a statement, essentially,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm curious, how PR-ish this felt? Who feels like this was mostly PR, or, yeah? If Lynn, if you don't think it was PR, it was trying.
I know there's a lot of cynicism around it, and I mean, I don't question the sincerity really of the people who made this statement. Mm-hmm. I do believe that they believe that they do pay attention to their stakeholders. And there is a sense in which they do, but it's a very vague sense. It's not a sense of we owe our stakeholders the following and we're going to be accountable for it. There was not that kind of accountability written in. So I think there was just a lot of confusion, really, and not really clear thinking, at least not clear thinking of the type that I like to see when someone makes an announcement like that.
Yeah. Tony, did it change how you run your company, or you ran the company at the time?
No, really, no. I kind of have the fortune that our company, our mission right from the outset was building sustainable competitive advantage. So the long term was part of our language from the beginning, and engendering pride in our employees and the way we go about that. So like we heard from Ravi this morning, I mean, institutions are out there and they're doing this, and they're never losing sight of the importance of constituencies. Without our employees, we're nothing. And so we know that without the word stakeholder be used. So we changed very little. We do not use the word stakeholder in our company.
A lot of companies do.
And I was going to say, so language has definitely shifted more to stakeholder. And the reason we avoid it is because words matter. And that word was chosen very specifically to get parity to shareholder. And we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but that's the intention. And then we get into this issue of what does that mean if you get parity to shareholder? And that's why we've resisted, not because we don't think all those constituencies are extremely important, because they are, but rather that it for me, sets a confusion that I don't really know how to manage a company from anymore.
Mm-hmm. Did you see that in other companies that you were like your competitors, other ones that you were watching?
No, I would say most companies, you see the language a lot more. I think you see expectations from constituency groups that are growing. But really, most businesses, I would say, did not change a lot. Legally, I think bylaw work has been done that says no bylaws, most bylaws did not get changed. So, which really sets the true purpose of a corporation.
A lot of boards didn't say, issue this statement either, right? It wasn't like the CEOs did it without the boards signing off on it, essentially.
Correct. I know of no evidence that says the boards of the Roundtable were consulted on this, actually.
Yeah.
To speak of.
Well, there's actually research saying that they weren't.
And that's interesting, because your point about the fiduciary duty, that really rests with the board. So, so you see this kind of disconnect where some of the executives are signing on to this, but the fiduciary duty of a publicly traded board is very specific to shareholders. And so the law has not changed. I mean, for example, in the nonprofit space, the fiduciary duty of obedience, is to the charitable purpose, to the mission. So there's a fiduciary duty to focus on stakeholders in the nonprofit space, which is particularly absent in the for-profit space, and which was not affected one iota by this, not a bit. So it was a very interesting dichotomy between the executives and between the boards.
That's interesting.
But there is also a lot of confusion around how the fiduciary duty should be interpreted under current law. And if you ask the law professors, you have some who say, look, the law says, the language is, you have a fiduciary duty to the corporation and its shareholders. As the corporation consists of all of these other parties. So that if you are maximizing, serving the interests of the corporate entity, you must consider the interests of these stakeholders. But that doesn't mean you're serving those interests for their own sake. You're serving them for the interests of the company. Exactly. Other law professors would say, no, you're supposed to serve the interests of the shareholders, not the company. So it's a constituency view. So there's even a debate within the legal community about how to understand the fiduciary duty under current law, never mind this new
statement.
Right.
Yeah, gotcha. I wanted to bring you in the conversation here. Did you have something?
Yeah, I just want to say that, so there are certain technical legal aspects that we are talking about, why boards did what they did, why corporates did what they did, what the law says about it, what the accountancy profession says about it. But I think, this was a time of extreme change. Lots of things were happening in society. The middle class was getting hollowed out. There was huge amount of inequality prevailing. There's huge amount of social unrest. All the kinds of things were there. And I think this is a time for some kind of leadership thinking on the part of the board. This is not the time where you sort of cotton on to, what the law says, the do's and the don't, and this is what I learned in this course, this is what this professor says. This is a time to do some creative thinking. Get out of the box, right? So I think at some level, and mind you, I'm a board animal. I have served on maybe more than 20, 30 boards, in the last 10, 20 years, as Tony is. So I don't mean any disrespect to the board members, but being an independent director myself, I think that this was a time, call for leadership, call for action. And I think largely it is the independent directors who have failed the system, if I can use this word. It is the independent directors who were not bold enough, or if they did take the initiative, sort of buckled down to the other corporate pressure from the same board, maybe promoters, maybe investors, maybe the CEO, maybe something like that. And I think it speaks to the kind of people we are, right? So I have chaired a large bank. I've been on some of the marquee boards across the world, and I have failed this world in helping the boards to take the right leadership so that they could have taken the right decision at that point of time, so that today we would not be in the kind of state we are. Today the planet is almost on the verge of collapse for a variety of reasons, and maybe that's a different topic. But I really feel that in the world of all the types of organizations that human beings have made to benefit ourselves collectively, like clubs and trusts and associations and cooperatives and political parties, the most powerful, the most effective is the corporate business. These guys can do anything. There are corporations here in America whose revenues, even profits, are larger than the GDP of many countries across the world. These guys can move mountains. These guys can move, capital or technology or people across countries, across boundaries. They can do anything. They can make policy, they can shape policy, they can influence policy, right? There is nothing, I really believe it, that there is nothing with a good set of dedicated board members cannot make happen anywhere in the world, right? And that is why I'm saying that these are the people who failed humanity. Because, again, whether it's a value system game or whether it is you're wearing blinkers, you're focused on something here when you should have been focused on something here, it was all about profit maximization. It was all about, if I'm the CEO and I can make a few $1,000,000 if I do this, that and the other, but not this, that and the other. But if that, this, that and the other is more important for humanity, you somehow have blinkers. You don't look at it, you don't notice it, you are not moved by it, right? So wherever in India I speak on some of these topics, I say it's not about us. Think about our grandchildren. Then the penny drops. What's going to happen to them if you continue to behave like this as leaders and as board animals? So I strongly believe that at some level, as individuals, as leaders, as human beings, we have both individually and collectively failed to understand and therefore failed to act or perform to take the right decision, to provide the right leadership for this. That's what I believe.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think boards internationally are really interesting too, right? You have countries like Germany where it's mandated that an employer is on the board, so the constituency, stakeholder, that these words that we've heard, there are different ways of putting boards together to consider all of those. But Jamie, you were nodding while Om was speaking.
Yeah, he was. I very much appreciated his comments because I think a lot of the failures in corporations, which maybe have stimulated some of the more media-driven interest in stakeholder engagement, were failures of governance.
Of corporate governance.
Yeah, corporate governance. So to link these two comments together, take a look at what Boeing is struggling with right now, and no one would argue that they have a good relationship with their stakeholders, and they don't have a good relationship with their shareholders at this point either. They're not returning much value, and you can track that to this kind of confluence between the lack of leadership and then a very subtle but very significant change in the competencies that were manifested on the board. So when Boeing was an exemplar company and had good relationships in the communities that they worked in with their employees, they had a very interesting balance of kind of a preponderance of engineering expertise on the board, secondary to finance. And then as it began to change, the engineering and hence the quality focus was replaced exclusively by finance focus. So the Boeing board, in the last couple of years which precipitated all of the difficulties that they're experiencing, were focused on short-termism and were focused on finance, and the board didn't manifest leadership in the way you're describing it. They manifested financial leadership in terms of maximization of short-term value and squeezing the supply chains and outsourcing and single sourcing and things like that, which directly resulted in what they're struggling with now. So I see that as a failure of leadership. I also see it as a structural kind of facilitation of that failure of leadership by the composition mechanism of the board. You also see that we're at the founding of attempts to be made. One other example is OpenAI, where everyone was terrified about artificial intelligence, and they said, and we're going to create a company that's going to really go after this, so let's not let the profit motivation, perhaps destroy humanity. Let's create a not-for-profit parent, and have the for-profit be a subsidiary of the not-for-profit parent, so there's a charitable purpose to this. And the board did, manifesting leadership, what it was supposed to do. When the executives got too far ahead and said, "Oh, you're placing profits over the potential to destroy the world, so we're going to fire you," there was a huge outcry, and what happened? The short-term finance won. So even with a structure of we want to have a stakeholder focus, there is the pull and the swimming against the tide is so great. It's very difficult to manifest that type of leadership, even when you have the structures that were set up to facilitate it.
And I just want to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
His point regarding composition of the board. This is really very, very important. How the board is composed of. So when you have to select a board, you decide what are the characteristics that are required in this board. So a Boeing company would have a certain set of characteristics. A bank would have a slightly different set of characteristics. So there'll be a great amount of commonality, but there'll be differences because of the domain in which you operate, or the country in which you operate, or the challenges that particular corporation is having at that point of time. So if you look at different board, so for example, if there is a promoter-led company, right, it will have a particular kind of board. It will be largely subservient, right? If not, it cannot really exist, or the directors will not exist, they'll be fired or whatever it is, right? So there, how good leadership the board will provide or the company will provide is entirely up to the promoter, his value system, his morals, his ethics, whatever it is, right? So the company is only, these days, from the 80s onwards, there's a lot of private equity which is coming into this space, right? And you will find invariably the promoter and the private equity, they do not see eye to eye on the future of the company, right? The private equity is very short term, 3 years, maybe 5 years, sometimes 2 years also.
Little longer nowadays.
Nowadays it is a little longer, you're right, because things have changed. But the mindset is to get out as quickly as possible, right? So they drive the company completely differently from what the promoters do. And sometimes there is a conflict, sometimes there is a stalemate. But in either case, it is the company and the stakeholders, shareholders and stakeholders, both suffer. Now, if you were to move from there to a professionally run board, then there is another set of challenges that comes in, right? Because a professionally run board, again, it depends upon how the board is constituted. If there are a lot of technical people or a lot of financial people, then it is one way. If there are consultants and leadership coaches kind of thing, then it's another way. None of these boards thinks it is important to have somebody who can look into the future, a wise person, or I don't know how to describe this person, but traits of this person are there in all of us. But it is not the predominant trait. It is a trait which comes up now and then, depending upon the context, and then it recedes, right? So composition of the board is something by law, what is defined, composition of board is in terms of ratios and certain other technical requirements. But here we require a certain holistic wisdom and how to bring it down technically so that the boards become conscious of it and so that they can actually select those kinds of people so that collectively the board reflects the kind of wisdom which a company like Boeing should have. They could have killed thousands of people just like that, right? So I just wanted to add to Amy's point.
I see a lot of nodding there. So we're going to get into stakeholder capitalism, what that means, how it could perhaps be structured, what some of the problems are for moving in that direction. But I got to go back to Tony to ask. It sounds like you feel like we don't even, like everything's, I'm not being facetious here, but it's almost like everything's fine, the system is working, this is the way it works best, let's not mess with this system. We're all long-term thinkers here.
No, I think that's why I said the opportunity was missed. I think there is more short-termism. I think there is private equity, for example. While I think it's more nuanced than that, right? Because selling something that doesn't have a future doesn't work either. So, but I think that's the opportunity lost. I think we could have been talking about short-termism and not about stakeholderism, because I think when we get into it, we're going to realize, at least in my mind, that it's sort of an unmanageable concept. But I won't jump ahead on that. But
it's okay.
So no, do I think everything hunky-dory? No system is perfect. But do I believe that a free market system where businesses are sort of self-interest motivated to meet the needs of customers and be focused on that, I think the simplicity of it drives a very complex and successful system. I think that system is a sharp-edged tool. Now, we have to figure out how to use that tool as a society. And what I worry about with stakeholders and where we're going is that we're going to try to bring in all the division in our society into the businesses. And so what are we going to get? Businesses that are about as efficient as our governments, because we're going to be torn apart by all of these different groups. Today, I keep my CEOs focused outside. Look to the outside. Meet the needs of your customers. Right? This becomes a very internal focus for these businesses now when you go down this path. I don't see how that's a recipe for more efficiency.
Can I push back on that?
Yeah, go for it.
So linking that comment to Om's comment, you don't want to bring in the divisiveness and the dysfunction of government, but there's very good research that shows, let's talk about diversity, diversity on the board, that diverse boards make better decisions, are more likely to manifest the type of leadership that Om was talking about. Why? And the answer is it's not the diversity in and of itself, but it's because the diversity injects tension, if not conflict, into the deliberation. And so the key then is it can go in the direction that you're describing, which is it can be dysfunctional. But if you create good governance processes and you have containment vessels so that so that the expectation is of dynamic tension, almost an organizational Hegelian dialectic, then you can harness that force, and then you can get different perspectives and different, and that's exactly why diversity makes, decision making better. So I think there's got to be some way to avoid your concern, so that we don't simply devolve into the divisiveness that we see in broader society and the dysfunction that we see in federal government. But we recognize that one of the reasons stakeholderism is rising is because we see, the worldwide growth of the middle class, and therefore very, very diverse perspectives being injected into something that used to be incredibly homogenous.
I agree with all that. I would just say that I think the shareholder system has an answer to that, because shareholders are caring about this. I'm answering this question all the time about diversity. So
talk more about that.
Part of what we forget about is that the world's evolving. The customers want more from us. You think about sustainability. Most companies were doing a lot about sustainability before the Business Roundtable ever said this, because our customers care about it, right? Our shareholders care about it. I'm answering shareholder questions on diversity and social issues all the time, and that's totally legitimate.
Is that new?
It certainly has grown,
Yeah.
because these are legitimate concerns. By the way, Om and I totally agree. I think that we all want a world that deals with these questions. My only question is, how best do you deal with them?
Yeah.
Right? And shareholders want the same thing, so they're asking for this.
We're kind of at one extreme where you have, we've got this profits, take care of profit first, take care of profits first, everything else will take care of itself, that kind of, mentality on one end. And then you've got the fear at the other end is that we're going to have an electoral college of boards that's trying to decide how to move companies forward. And that's, we want to be somewhere in between, probably. Yeah.
But this electoral college is very important. See, why is there a board? See, when somebody starts a business...
Why is there a board?
Yeah. When somebody starts a business, Tom, Dick, and Harry, he's the CEO of that business. He's also the janitor of that business. He's the salesperson. He's the accountant. He's the lawyer. He's everything. And he gives 24 hours per day to that business. Wife and family be damned, right? The first priority is business. But as the business grows, he has 1 employee, 2 employees, 10 employees, 15 employees. Then suddenly the role starts getting segregated, right? Then comes in a bank loan, and then comes in a private equity and all those kinds of things. So suddenly from one owner, now there are 1,000 owners or there are 1 million owners, right? Now, these owners of this business, they can't do anything to that business. They don't know the business, right? They have no control, no influence, zero, nothing, right? Now, who's the guy who's going to be proxy to the owners, look after their interests? It's the board. Which is why this creature named as the board came up, right? And which is why the board's responsibility is to the shareholders. And in India, by law, it is said the maximum responsibility is to the majority of the minority. So there might be institutional shareholders, there might be promoter shareholders, there might be some bulk shareholders, right? But if there are individual shareholders like us sitting here in this panel, then any resolution or many resolutions, and they are differentiated, cannot be passed if the majority of the minority, which may be of the aggregate only 10% or 12%, if they refuse, you can't pass anything like that, right? So just to say, why is there a board? The board looks after the interests of the shareholders, because the shareholders cannot look after their interests in the company because they have no locus standi there, right? So which is why, the board is not going to go away. Which is why it is important to understand about the composition of the board and how we compose a better board, right? So some of the things are, those practices which are used by headhunters, when they look for a CEO or, compatibility, collaboration and all those experience, this, that and the other. So the boards unfortunately get selected on, Peter knows Paul and Paul knows Bob, and so, so that is one of the major, they look at consistency, they look at convenience, they look at fellow feeling that whether I'll get along with him or not. So what Jamie said was that if there is diversity in the board, it brings about a kind of tension. I would like to call it creative tension, right? So, but all diverse people will not bring creative tension. Some of them will bring destructive tension. So the selection of the board, the art and science of selection of the board becomes very, very important, right? And diversity mostly when people speak about diversity in the board, they speak about gender diversity, but it is cognitive diversity. It is experiential diversity. Where the hell do you come from, right? So what is it that you're carrying in your head all the time, which means so much more for you? It may not mean to somebody else, but maybe it is a critical point for decision making for something important. So board composition, board diversity, and unfortunately today there is no focus on getting the character of the board right. The focus is on getting the right directors on the board, but not collectively, what the board should be. Not only is there no focus on it, but because there is no focus, there are no tools and practices on how to make it happen, right? I feel that A, because the board is not going to go away, and B, because at some level it is the most important decision maker. I mean, it may not be able to make things happen, but it can stop anything from happening. If you say no, that's it. No, you can't do this, right? They never say no.
Could I jump in,
Yeah, Lynn,
in
please.
here, on this question of why do we have a board? That's I want to bring in a perspective that I don't think we should forget, and it comes from when I teach corporate governance to bring directors into our executive programs. I often ask this question: why do we have a board? And we have lots of answers why we have a board. And finally, someone will say, well, I think you're legally required to have a board. Right?
Yeah.
Which is true. But this is a reminder that the corporation itself and the board are creatures of law. They are not creatures of, as a private investor, you cannot create a corporation without registering with the state. This is something, this is an incredible innovation in our society that you can have a corporation and you are required to have a board, and the board by law is the governing body of this entity. So another reason we have boards is that as a society, somebody's got to be responsible for this thing called the corporation that we've created and given incredible power to. And in fact, we've given incredible power to these shareholders who have no liability for anything that gets done by this company.
Yeah, it's a nice kind of owner to be.
So you've got to think there's a potential kind of huge moral hazard issue here. Somebody needs to be in charge. So we've decided that we're going to have a board. So that's another reason that you're there. And I think it's very important if you serve on a board that you recognize that there is that public dimension of your service as well as your obligations to your shareholders. And I believe that you do have obligations to these other parties, regardless of whether it enhances shareholder value. You are obliged, for example, not to injure people, not to dump your waste into the community water supply. It might maximize shareholder value. In fact, some economists, Luigi Zingales and his colleague, have done some research showing that it was actually did maximize shareholder value over a 30-year period for DuPont to dump its waste into the community water supply in a lot of communities. So I don't think the shareholder value, even long-term, is going to solve all the problems. You have to have some sense of obligation. But the question is, how far does it go?
Yeah.
How far does it go? And that's where there's no clarity around that, I would say.
Yeah.
Just 10 seconds, what Lynn said just now, it reminded me of another quote of Mahatma Gandhi. He said that whenever you are in a decision-making stage and it is very difficult to take a decision, you think of or look at the poorest man that you know and think how this decision will impact him. He's the stakeholder, right? Mm-hmm. And then you take a decision. I mean, somewhat akin to what she's saying.
Yeah. I mean, I love being at universities. I think we have Hegel and Gandhi in the same conversation.
That's the goal, right?
It really is. It's great. We're looking for a third now. Lynn, I want to stick with you because I think we've heard that, there's certainly disagreement here across the panel as to what extent we should mess with shareholder value maximization to move forward. And giving, one answer is government can set the laws, society can set the laws, set the parameters for corporations to work in. and then we'll go forward. If you want us to take the environment into account, if you want us to, pay employees more, we can do that. Just tell us and, pass laws. There's probably a sense that government isn't doing enough of that, and there's social pressure on companies to change things. But what's stopping stakeholder capitalism from moving forward? We've heard about the statement. Boards didn't really do a lot afterwards. There haven't been bylaw changes. There's been use of stakeholder language a lot, but what's stopping it from gaining more momentum?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I think it's important before we talk about that just to say that there has been, I think, some incorporation of stakeholders that goes beyond just the language, because I have seen examples of companies starting to be more systematic in how they think about their stakeholders, to really do an analysis, a stakeholder analysis, before taking a serious decision. How does it affect this one? How does it affect that one? Can we revise our plans so that it works better for our stakeholders? So I think it has been more widely used, but as a management tool rather than a governance theory, shall we say. So
Gotcha.
I think maybe thinking about that, in fact, when Ed Freeman introduced his idea of stakeholder management back in 1984, he said exactly that. He said, this is a tool for management. It doesn't matter what your objective is. You always need to think about your stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been used as a tool. Why hasn't it caught on more, though? And I sometimes compare this to the whole shareholder value movement. And there are a lot of things missing. One is clarity about the idea.
Shareholder value
maximization was very clear. There was an underlying theory, agency theory, that explained 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I won't go into the theory unless we want to talk about it. But anybody could understand it. And it was very simple. They offered a performance measure, total shareholder return. And here's how you calculate it. And this is what you're supposed to go for. The theory, one of my colleagues worked on this theory, told us how we should design executive compensation so that we maximize shareholder value. The theory told us how we should design the organization to give decision rights to people and to give incentives throughout the organization to maximize value for shareholders. There was also, importantly, a whole program of legal and regulatory changes and shareholder organization to change bylaws, to give shareholders more power and to prevent companies from adopting things that shareholders didn't like, such as poison pills, to slow down takeovers. Investors put pressure on companies to adopt bylaws that say, we're going to opt out of these statutes in certain states that allow us to consider other stakeholders. So it was a very organized program. Yeah. For stakeholder advocates, we don't see that. We don't have clarity about what it is we're talking about. We don't have an implementation plan.
Sounds like the theory is still developing.
The theory itself, honestly, when I look at what's the theoretical underpinnings of this, it's not very satisfying, and it's not very well developed compared to agency theory underneath the shareholder value maximization. So there's just a lot more work to do.
Yeah. I want to stick with you for one more second. What's the biggest misconception about stakeholder capitalism that you want to clear up?
Well, it depends. So if you're a critic of stakeholder capitalism, I think the biggest misconception is that it's a distraction from shareholder value. And some people have argued that if you get focused on your stakeholders, you're going to lose focus on shareholder value. What I think we've learned from this experiment that's been going on is that actually the interests of these parties are interdependent often, and that if you want to maximize value for your shareholders, you better understand your stakeholders and how they're going to react and incorporate that into your thinking. So for the critics, I would say that. For the advocates, I think the biggest misconception is that this is going to solve all of these problems that we're talking about. That if we have effective stakeholder capitalism, then the environmental problem will be solved, and the income inequality problem will be solved, and we won't have to worry about all of these other problems. I think it's much more difficult than stakeholder advocates acknowledge to actually align everybody's interests over the long term. You have some really difficult trade-offs that you have to make from time to time.
And I think that's a great point. And I'd add to it, though, that I think that gets to your first question about why it hasn't really taken off is the shareholder value movement is easily measurable. The stakeholder value movement tends to be as a result of negative. So the shareholder value tends to be positive, the return of capital, the growth of the middle class, that stuff. The stakeholder stuff tends to be born from horror stories, from either corporate malfeasance or unintended consequences, which then cause problems, in the environment, in society, or conscious decisions, even, that the oil companies made in their planning processes to understand the implications of global warming, but to not act on that to be able to, which then conflates, shareholder value with greed and unmitigated greed. So I think that's part of the issue is that the stakeholder issue tends to be a response and tends to be more negative occurrence based, and the shareholder value tends to be a value and tends to have more short-term positives associated with it.
That's really interesting. It makes me think about, you brought up Sarbanes-Oxley earlier, right? And it's, a lot of businesses complained about it. They thought we're going to have to do all this extra work and just to, appease everyone. Some companies found that, hey, it was really good to document your processes, that it was easier to bring people in. If you had turnover, everything was clear, you had a lot more rules. So once you did the work, it could be a competitive edge. Lynn's talking about how hard stakeholder capitalism can be, but it sounds like, doing the work can pay off if companies end up doing this right.
Well, the Sarbanes specifically, what you're referring to is more the management stuff like the attestation requirements. But the real issue, it was more what Ohm was talking about. I'd be curious to Lynn's opinion on this, but it was the institutionalization of the separation of management from governance. Mm-hmm. It was, you've got to have a board, not just for the legal reasons that you described, but now it needs to be independent from executive management. Precisely so you can get the type of dispassionate oversight that hopefully can rise above a short-term focus. And so, yes, the CEO can still be the chair of the board, but if you do that, you have to have an independent director who presides over 2 meetings of the board without the CEO present at least twice a year. So those very specific structural mechanisms were designed to, take the question that we're talking about and say, now what's the difference between the executives and the board in addressing this concept? And that the board, consistent with this legal ontology, is supposed to have a broader purpose, and so that was really the interesting kind of reverberating component, in my opinion, of Sarbanes-Oxley, was this stuff we now take for granted, director independence. That stuff didn't exist, before Sarbanes-Oxley, so, and yet we talk about it as a given. And I think if you compare the Business Roundtable to the regulatory perspective, I don't see the Business Roundtable percolating into the consciousness the same way that, that Sarbanes-Oxley did.
Right.
But it was mandated.
Yeah, right. And everyone has to do it. So it's, right. Tony, we're kind of coming towards the end here, and I'm going to ask a little bit about, what you see for the future, but I would love to just briefly stick in the now with you each have interesting perspectives on just dealing with these questions now under the current system. What are your biggest fears about being pushed in this direction?
Well, I think, Lynn talked about one of the things that she sees as the negative, but I do actually think that measurability and performance measurement is a massive problem.
It's just because you don't have it, or it's foggy?
No, it's not even if you have the data. The problem is that you've got, if you put everybody on an equal level, they have opposing interests. Right, they have common interests, of course, but they also have, a supplier, for example, would like to get paid a lot more and give you a lot less. That's not really in your customer's interest, right? And so these are competing interests, and so I really don't know how you're going to balance all that. Even if you can measure it all, and I map, maybe we'll do all that.
Well, even within a so-called constituency, you might have employers.
Thank you.
in conflict, employees in conflict with each other.
Exactly, you do. I mean, you've got union employees, you've got non-union employees, you've got employees over in low labor markets, right, versus higher labor cost markets. So how is that fair? Is it a good thing to do for these stakeholders to create more jobs at lower pay some more, or should it be more? I mean, so all those questions, and that's why we moved off to diversity. But I think I wasn't really dealing with. It's more the goals and competing goals, not voices. And that's what I'm not sure an easy answer to that. So I do worry about that. I think that politics is the other piece of this, right? Everything is political. And you can see businesses getting pulled in under this argument into political debates. I think Disney's a great example where you had a constituency that pulled them in.
Right.
And there are other examples. I can tell you I'm getting asked publicly a lot when I was still CEO about political issues, Russia being an example. And that never used to happen. But now there's an expectation that you should be able to answer that. And I think I worry about that for businesses, right? Partly because the CEO, I can't even ask a CEO if I hire them what their politics are. Now they're answering
as the board, you're not allowed
as a
to
member of
ask
the board.
them,
Yeah.
So we could change that law.
A question though. You were mentioning shareholders earlier, and of course shareholders, they're as diverse as every other constituency, and you have some who want you to take a position and some who don't want you to take a position. If we were to just focus on shareholders, do you think this issue would go away? Because I see the shareholders themselves are becoming more activist and expecting more. So I'm not sure it's the stakeholder focus that's drawing business into politics as much as the whole changing society.
Well, that could be true. I have not had a case where shareholders really said you should take an advocate position in a topic. I think they certainly have their views and opinions, but I think it's pretty easy to say to everyone, that's not really my role. My role is to try to drive value with this enterprise. And as a shareholder, I'm going to give you a fair return on that, and you get to decide where you put your money, where your causes are. You didn't really put me in charge to do that for you. So I'd say would accept that.
Mm-hmm. That's the Milton Friedman,
Well, but I think one reason I'm raising this is there's been some academic literature and some research advocating that there should be more shareholder votes on all of these many more issues, and that also seems very problematic.
It is, and actually what's interesting about that is it's backing up a little bit now. That was more 2 years ago, and now you're seeing a little bit less of that push, but back to these are the things I worry about. Is that again, I talk about the SHARP tool, but you had this really sort of simple goal of managers, and I knew how to hire people to do that and have them go do it. Mm-hmm. This is a much more complex world if this is really where we're headed. And again, I want to remind everybody, I still think, to me, all the constituencies have to be taken care of in a good capitalist system. Yeah. So I'm not ignoring at all the needs of employees or anybody else, but I think it can be done by a good shareholder system as well.
Yeah.
But I think overall there has been some progress. I would even say there has been good progress. So there have been, we made progress, we've gone back, we've found new problems. But if you look at the rise of the B Corp in America, if you look at what Unilever does, they have now a sustainable living plan for the whole world, which includes water, environment, things like that. If you look at, for example, in India, which is one of the poorer, if not the poorest countries in the world, they're beginning to talk about, the corporates are talking about, so there is a legal concept of minimum wage. But the corporates are now talking about sustainable wage, living wage. So from minimum wage to living wage, because minimum wage is like in the US, I think it's $8.25 an hour. But a living wage would be, say, $20 an hour, something like that. So corporations are themselves talking about it. They'll have to pay out more. So in fact, in one of the boards, and I won't name it, I said, look, you have to assess how much more it will cost, how much it will hit your margins. And then maybe the board will say that we are okay with it, right? We'll explain it to the market so that share valuation, etc. So I think overall there has been some progress, and I think it is significant in some countries, some companies, etc., etc. And we need to find ways to encourage that, because I think, I said earlier, and I really believe in that business corporates are really very powerful. If they get it into their minds, they can do things. And today we are sitting at the intersection of multiple challenges, right? Just geopolitical is one, but climate is another, sustainability and all those issues. And here again, I have seen that where the corporates have put their mind to it, they've been able to put capex and other resources, whether it is about carbon emissions, whether it is about water, they have been able to do things, right? So looking at the good part of what has happened, so there are a lot of challenges, and to find ways to encourage and motivate them to do more. See, there are more challenges on the horizon. Somebody mentioned about AI, right? AI, how to regulate that. Social media. I think one of the biggest reasons for vicissitude and the kind of polarization fights, battles that are taking place in the world is social media. It is completely unregulated, and it puts every person in his own hell or her own hell, right? So we need to find some way to regulate that. If you look at data, the way we deal with data, if we look at researches in genetics and molecular biology, you can make anything out of anyone, right? And I was horrified to read recently some research in the lab. Actually, you can, in the lab at home, in your garage, you can buy stuff from the market to do things, right? There is no regulation around some of this. Why I'm saying all this is that you and me cannot do much about it. But some of these corporates and corporate leaders can get together with the government. And why I say, see, the government makes things happen if they are goaded to make things. See, the politicians, they're not there permanently. They come and go, 5-year, 3-year, 4-year terms. The corporate leaders, they're there in perpetuity. And I believe that because they have started businesses, grown businesses, become a world-class business, or because they have entered as an executive and become a CEO, something like that, there is a lot of merit in these guys. They're good guys, they're great guys. So they may have their pitfalls and shortfalls and black spots and this, that, and the other. But in the aggregate, a guy who is successful in a corporate, on average, is much better than a politician, right? So if they can get together.
On average, so what about the median?
If they can get together, sorry?
What about the median or the mean? Yeah.
So if they can get together and, talk these things, whether it's around regulation, whether it is about the kind of change that is required, it's badly required. We're running out of time. We don't have time. At the pace at which change is happening, it'll be all done for our grandchildren. So we need to find a way to make it fast.
You have helped sort of kick off this closing stage here for the panel because we want to be able to go to take your questions. We're just looking forward to the future here now. Jamie, maybe let me come to you next. What's your hope for how boards are going to operate and how this can be changed going forward? Like, what's your hope for 5 years from now?
I would hope that the independence of governance and management continues. I would hope, to Om's point, that boards are selected not just for individual characteristics, but for the cultural characteristic of the group as a whole, in order to be able to engage, more generatively in more generative thinking and more leadership thinking. I'm often struck by some of the more pronounced corporate and governance failures have been, where you had boards that were composed of people with remarkable skill sets. Enron had an incredible board. The individuals, but they were corrupted, if not co-opted by other issues. So I'd hope for that kind of separation. And I would say at a minimum, before, not to get too granular in the issue of stakeholders, is it employees, is it suppliers, is it all that, that there would be some start with a general sense of, the environment as a whole and society as a whole. And that at least we could adopt a primum non nocere, a do no harm model. It's just kind of a start before we get into the more challenging issues of, we have all these multiple stakeholders with different opinions and we can't satisfy them all. At least, consider the gestalt and say how can we, return value to the shareholder and make certain that in doing so, we're not going to, accelerate the degradation of the environment. We're not going to, we're not going to get so big necessarily that like CrowdStrike or Change Healthcare, that if something goes wrong, it reverberates through the whole ecosystem of business, and you run the risk of shutting down the whole ecosystem of business. So that kind of expansion of an enterprise risk management mentality to go beyond simply the risk to the corporation, but to see the corporation as a potential agent of risk to the broader environment, and making sure that that's at least acknowledged and mitigated. That would be my Christmas wish.
Gotcha. Tony?
Yeah, I won't surprise anybody. I think more conversation, focus on the long term, talking about these constituents in a more formalized basis, right? Whether you name them, stakeholders or not, I think it's really important. And I think for society, it's still thinking, how do we leverage this profit motivation vehicle that works to do good for society? So rather than trying to, like an inside out, so this whole conversation about making the inside deal with this, but maybe it's a better idea that you let these things be what they are and you as a society harness that. An example of that would be environmental, trade credits, et cetera. Create markets that do the good for society in my mind, is a much better way to harness the power of what business is really good at. And I think what Om said, I think these are the most powerful entities, organizations that we have in our society. And as you can hear, I really worry that what we're going to do is hurt them. And what I'd rather do is figure out a way to harness them.
That's great. Om, you wanted to add something?
I have an optimistic view and a pessimistic view. The optimistic view is, there was a time when smoking was very macho. Clint Eastwood, he always has a cigarette in his mouth, and people are smoking cigars and pipes and this, that, and the other, right? Then suddenly society realized that smoking causes cancer, kills people and all that. It took a lot of time. But suddenly now you'll find that hardly anybody smokes. The theory is that once 25% people stopped smoking, it's a tipping point. Suddenly, it became shameful to smoke in public, etc., etc. Now, what is happening, the change in the corporate mindset vis-a-vis stakeholder, shareholder, and all the other issues that we discussed, I would say that it is creeping change. I personally am not happy about it. But I feel that it is possible that a tipping point will come when X number or X percentage of corporates globally talk about X percentage of these issues. And suddenly the tipping point comes, then everybody becomes sort of, linked to it. Right? And suddenly without our knowing, everybody is fully aligned. It has happened to smoking. It has happened to many other things like that. So there is a corporate psychological view available on this. The pessimistic point that I have is, and I was sharing it with someone today, that because of what is happening in Ukraine and Gaza and many other, there are trade conflicts, there is not only saber rattling, there is nuclear saber rattling that is going on. So I was telling someone today that 20 years out in the future, the historians then will look back at this time and say, this was the time of the Third World War. So that is the pessimistic view.
That was really pessimistic.
But I hope it is the optimistic view which prevails.
Let's focus on the tipping point. William, what do we have to? Om brought up this idea of a tipping point, and it's not the shareholder it's not the Business Roundtable statement or the pledge that seems to be the tipping point. We may be working towards it. What has to happen? Both in in academia and in the business world, but what do you think are the key success factors
for World War III here?
I know.
But bringing it back to our conversation, I think at a firm level, I would hope that boards and senior leadership teams would find a block of time to sit down and ask themselves, who are our stakeholders and what do we owe them? What are we prepared to commit to? So when I've looked at all this stakeholder conversation over the years, I've actually identified at least 4 quite distinct interpretations that at least is distinct to me. I actually wrote an article about it. One of them says, we're going to pay attention to our stakeholders as a means of maximizing shareholder value. That's sort of an instrumental view. Another one says, we're going to commit to fulfilling our ethical and legal obligations to our stakeholders. That's kind of what I call a classic stakeholder view. There's another one that says, we're actually going to commit to improving the welfare of all of our stakeholders. This is sort of the Paul Pullman view. I call that one beneficial stakeholderism. We're trying to benefit everyone. And then there's a structural stakeholderism that says we're going to start giving stakeholders real power in the system. We're going to allow employees to vote on who's on the board of directors, or we're going to put employees on the board of directors or other stakeholders. These are very different conceptions of stakeholderism, and the practical implications of each one are quite different. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's just kind of a muddle when people use the term. If leaders sat down, and boards don't take time to have these kinds of conversations, but if you could carve out a little time, get clarity on this, and think about what we do owe our stakeholders, including society, and then once you've got that, what's our plan for doing it? Is our organization designed to do it? Do we have the right processes to do it? Do we as a board have the right tools to oversee it? And importantly, you have to engage with your investors because, as we said, right now it is a system based on shareholder primacy. Shareholders are the only ones who vote. They're the only ones who can sue the board for breach of fiduciary duty. They determine the value of the company by buying and selling shares. So they have to be on board with this plan. And no matter what you want to do or what leadership you want to take, if they don't like it, they can vote you out of office. So bringing your shareholders into this conversation is super, super important. So that's just at a firm level. I will add that we as academics, I think, also need to get our house in order about what we're talking about and really think about what are the intellectual foundations of this. Because I feel like we've been talking about shareholder, stakeholder, but we should kind of lift our sights above that, because what we're really trying to struggle with, at least in my mind, is what kind of corporate governance is really most suitable for aligning the functioning and activities of corporations with the needs of society. And I don't know that what these two options that we've been debating are really even the right answer. There may be lots of other ways to think about this. So don't get stuck in this one debate, is what I would say.
Right, in this polarized world of ours, yeah. That was a fantastic closing summary. Really couldn't have done it better, any of us here. Let's go to questions, and we'll try to get as many as possible, but this has been really great. Can I start over there? You're standing right by the mic, so if you could jump up and get on mic. I'll come to you next, yeah.
All right, so thank you for the discussion. I had a question. You talked a lot about boards and the responsibility of boards. Has the structure of boards evolved enough in your view? Is it still dominant, sort of the classic lead director, comp committee, audit committee, nom and gov committee? Or are you seeing examples of boards that have evolved to better meet the needs of a more complex business world?
Well, I would say yes to both. So the majority are still classic and have not changed, but there are examples of some who have. But they're in the great minority. So it's typical still exactly as you've described it. The only across-the-board structural change in the for-profit world has been the increase in board size. You know, as the research has shown, because they used to be 7 to 9, and now they're closer to 11.
And remuneration.
Pardon me?
And remuneration.
Yeah. But you know, there's an interesting movement, because in the not-for-profit world, the size has been decreasing, because it used to be in the 30s, 40s, and the for-profit world size is increasing, and they're starting to meet in the middle. So that's the major structural change that is across all boards. But in terms of the committee structure and the expertise, the skill set needed to draw, not nearly as much as we would hope.
To Jamie's point, in the rare example category, I've been noticing or talking to boards about how they are incorporating climate oversight. And this is an area where there are a lot of different ways to do it, but some are kind of rethinking the structure and creating sustainability committees and putting climate with comp committee for incentives, putting it in different areas. So there's a distributed approach, there's a kind of one committee approach, but I feel that boards are getting so many more issues, and stuffing more into that bag is getting harder and harder. And so structural change is important, but even I think bigger changes may be afoot for boards to do what they're expected to do.
I've seen what you said. So the comp committee is now a people and comp committee. So
Yes,
and it's opened up its conversation about that, but it's stuffing it in sort of the same bag.
Mm-hmm. Another question here.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for a great discussion so far. My question is, we talked about a lot of things, one of them being a short-term versus long-term thinking, time horizon-wise. it feels to me like societally we're becoming more and more short term, and that's a trend, right, in that direction. My question is, how do we go back the other way? Like, what are the discourses, what are the things that need to happen to help us think more long term?
I'll take one on that since I kept saying the thing. I think but it's funny because I'm not usually a comp first thinker, but a comp is one on this, right? Our compensation systems for executives could be much more long-term focused, and they should be, right? So it's value you create over a longer period of time. We've improved in some ways. I mean, we used to be stock options, so you could just get a moment in time and make a hit. It tends to be more shares today, so I think that's been a good move. But you can do a lot more, whatever that metric is. I'm going to say total shareholder return, but over a long period of time. So it's not just a moment in time. The other thing, I think this deserves a lot more academic inquiry, because in theory, stock markets fix for this, right? Because the stock market takes a present value of a future of a business. So in theory, it's already covered, right? And I'd say the same thing about private equity, even though I'm quick to say in private equity that that they are short term. But the fact is, when you come to sell something, the very first question you get from people is, well, what's going to happen going forward? What size is this market? So you do get the questions at least imply that people do think about the long term of those potential decisions.
But I think it is also a deeper, societal question. There is now instant gratification for everything, right? So you get one thing, you're happy, you want something else, something else, something else. Now, whether it makes you actually depraved over time, I do not know, but it depends upon the speed and intensity of this instant gratification that you see. It has become a social problem, right? Likewise, there is no soulfulness, right, anymore. You just don't, So, if you look at, they talk about Generation Z and this, that, and the other, but even people in the boardroom, in corporates, people who work there, et cetera, they are not immune from this disease, right? So I think it's a far more deeper question. I agree with all that Tony said here, but it's become a humanity species issue. And so therefore there may be no easy or short-term answers. We will evolve as we will evolve, and that will decide some of it, because it cannot be done by law or by regulation or by anything, right?
Can I share just a small story about a family company that was struggling with this issue? And one of the things that happened in this family company is one of the younger generation had a child. And so the parent, who was the chairman of the board, decided that henceforth all strategic decisions would be measured by what would this child, who's named Zoe, how would this affect Zoe when she's 30 years old? And so a very concrete example that you can imagine and think about, what's that going to be in 30 years? I mean, finding some way to make it concrete, I think, is the challenge here.
Great question.
Once again, thank you. A great discussion. But I'm interested in what you think is the extent or maybe the limits of over-focus on stakeholders in terms of the impact on disruptive innovation and the reallocation of capital. Because those are the two things that we talk about as the strength of market capitalism, but they almost always alienate substantial groups of stakeholders. And I'd also like you to, if you could, elaborate on that a little bit in terms especially about mid-size to and emerging companies where this emphasis on innovation and reallocation of capital is so important.
Also, I think it's a really interesting question. It's obviously for the more shareholder biased part of the panel. For me, it's not that hard, right? You are going to have to pursue those technologies. That is what is in the interest of, I believe, in the interest of the customers and good for society. And I really am a believer that you will see redeployment. If people really do lose jobs over technology, I'm a believer they'll find redeployment of that. I know that there's plenty who would worry the other side of it. But I don't know how this is a great example where this stakeholder issue becomes very hard. Right? Because if you really want to view employees as a stakeholder, then you might actually say no to that technology. I don't know that any of us really think that's the right long-term answer for society. I certainly do not. Right? I do think thinking long-term, how you treat people, and this is the point. How you treat people today affects how loyal they are to you tomorrow. So you're going to have to find a way to be as good a custodian for those people as you can be, but you're going to have to move on with the technology, I believe. So, and small company, big company, I just want to, we didn't really talk about this, but I think one of the other things with regulatory, which we didn't spend a lot of time on, is regulations tend to bias to big companies. So when we talk regulation, one of the other things you got to really think about is, what are you doing to the small players? Mostly you're forcing them out of business. And so you have to be careful of that one as well.
So we have another question in there. Yeah, hop on up.
Hello, good evening, dear panel. My name is Rajat, and my question was, how do you reconcile with the idea that big operations within companies, and they rely on public resources if their primary target is the shareholder benefit and not the stakeholder sustainability? How do you reconcile with the idea that they will still be supportive enough? In the sense that they will still help out with the activities of the big corporates and the big companies. So what do you think on that?
That's a good question. I always love that when you hear tech firms, they're like capitalism, entrepreneurship, et cetera, and it's all built on this, government internet that was a huge investment that was made.
I think you nailed it. I think the question nailed it, and your response just nailed it. And that gets into the broader question of corporate citizenship and taxation, and the recognition that that paying taxes as opposed to engaging in a conscious strategy to avoid the payment of taxes helps to water the bamboo so that it creates an environment where the infrastructure, whether it's highway for shipping or whether it's the internet for tech development, is going to happen and is going to persist. And I think that in the absence of that, you get the offshoring, you get the privatization, you get the opposite of that movement, which again is motivated by the short-term maximization of value. So the whole issue of the corporate citizen and to a very specific issue of taxation, I think is a very good balance, or issue where the dynamic of the shareholder and the stakeholder comes into stark relief. So how can they be a good corporate citizen?
Let's. We did have Hegel. We had Gandhi. But as far as a philosopher to help us understand capitalism and its evolution, you all together you did a pretty good job for a third philosopher. So thank you very much. Let's give this amazing panel a big hand.